Hello and welcome to the first of a series of webcasts delivered by Gowling WLG in the UK. Today you will be presented to by myself, Ursula Johnston, and Savannah Wood. So normally when we're delivering training, ideally that would be in person and we would have the opportunity to find out a little bit more about each other. So I just want to kick off by giving you a very brief introduction to the team at Gowling. So we are the EU Trade and Competition team. We have members of the team spread across our international offices. Myself, I very much focus on trade and customs regulations, and we have a focus on assisting clients with audit and dispute resolution. We also help with helping companies understand the regulatory barriers for import and export and sanctions. We also advise on implementing and adopting trade compliance programs and thinking about how legal teams can help support those. And more broadly and very timely, we look at how do clients and how do they prepare for geopolitical change, whether that be as we're undergoing now, COVID-19, which is obviously impacting global supply chain, Brexit, or looking more broadly at trends in international trade relations. We have a sector focus, so many of our clients are from life sciences, automotive and retail and manufacturing backgrounds. So as I mentioned, this particular session, which we've titled Introduction to the World Trade Organization, or WTO, forms one of a short series of what we're calling trade law bite size, with the idea that you can access these sessions as and when you can. And the idea is just to give you very much an introduction to some of the key themes and topics that surround international trade and the regulations. And we look at this as far as possible. We will look at this with a UK slant, but actually all the commentary that we will deliver is relevant to the global level, because we're looking at how global trade is regulated from the top umbrella, that's the WTO, and how does that trickle down into national provisions and legislation. So for this particular session, we're going to touch upon the origins of the WTO, look about membership and the current membership structure. We'll also talk a little bit about what's the WTO's mandate, what is the extent of their powers, and we'll also finish by thinking about the decision-making processes. And as I said, throughout this, we will try and think about what is the relevance to the UK, particularly as the UK stands today, not being within the middle of the transitional period. So I'm going to pass over to my colleague Savannah. Savannah is a junior lawyer in our EU Trade and Competition team, and she's going to kick off by talking about the origins of the WTO.
Thanks, Ursula. So, following the Second World War, the formation of an international trade organisation had been proposed by the architects of the Bretton Woods Agreement, with the idea being that such body would oversee a new multilateral system of international trade. The ITO was intended to sit alongside the International Monetary Fund. However, it never came into existence because of opposition in the US Congress, with the concern being that it would encroach excessively on domestic sovereignty. This led to a provisional agreement being negotiated, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, the GATT. The GATT was intended to preserve the tariff reduction commitments of parties until such time as the ITO was established. However, the GATT ended up becoming a permanent framework for the multilateral trading system and was considered to be the default basis. Various negotiations have been held under the GATT, initially relating to tariff reductions, but evolving to include other areas such as anti-dumping and non-tariff measures. Over time, the GATT therefore evolved into the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995, which was considered to be the biggest reform of international trade since the Second World War. So in terms of membership of the WTO, as we've mentioned, it's an umbrella organisation providing a forum for negotiation, treaty revision and also dispute settlement. As of the 30th of September 2018, the WTO had 164 members, which accounts for 98% of world trade. Some of the countries, amongst others, which are not yet members of the WTO include Iran, Iraq, Serbia and Algeria. For the negotiating members, their regime broadly follows the WTO regime. And this map we've included on the slide, those countries in green are currently WTO members, and those highlighted in yellow are the ones that are negotiating accession.
So I think, and then you'll see a couple of countries there shaded in grey, for example, North Korea, and those represent those countries that have not yet applied or have decided not to apply for to become a member of the WTO. So just to think about what's been the UK's involvement in the birth and the development of the WTO. So it was a founding party to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. So this is obviously pre-EU or EC membership days. So it was an original member of the WTO in its own right, with its own voice and voting power. But obviously, as the UK became a member of the EC and in turn the EU, European Union, so the UK's concessions and its commitments on what it essentially signs up to in terms of saying, well, this is how we will trade in goods, this is how we trade in services, these are the tariffs that we intend to apply. Those are all wrapped up in the EU schedule. So the UK doesn't have, as it stands, its own program. And as we are now in the midst of the transitional period, and at the time of this recording, which is mid-April 2020, the EU schedules continue to cover the UK throughout the transitional period. So, over the last 3 years, there's been a lot of discussion about, what does a no-deal Brexit mean for the UK, and that's often been referred to as a WTO, MFN, third-party Brexit. There's been lots of commentary in the press around what are the implications for the UK vis-a-vis its trade with other countries. So there's obviously has connotations for the current agreements with which the UK currently enjoys access to preferential markets under the current EU trade agreement frameworks. It will be continued to be treated as a member state of the EU for any ongoing, so that's current WTO disputes, to which the EU is a party. The EU has always obviously been a strong opponent of a multilateral trading system, and we suspect that to obviously continue, and for the UK to look at how can it have a positive influence on the development of the WTO as an institution and its policies as we enter 2021 and beyond. And interestingly, where we think the UK should sort of try and draw inspiration is to look at not at the noisier members of the WTO, which have a lot of clout just by the size, just by their sheer size and the volume of international trade. So, for example, the US, China, the EU, but actually to look at the tier below that. So, for example, how does Japan influence policy at the WTO? Canada, Singapore, and to learn lessons from those nations as to really the importance of not just talking to the big players in the global trade landscape, but all of those other countries where they have developed or developing economies, and to find out what can the UK do for those nations to help pull them into the sphere of global trade on a much more efficient level. Because by doing that, you increase your base of supporters essentially within the WTO membership base. If you would like to have a further insight on the UK's role in the WTO after Brexit, I highly recommend that you access a recorded forum that was put together by the Institute of Government last year, and indeed one of my colleagues, Bernardine Atkins, who leads our EU Trade and Competition team, is one of the panelists, and this will provide an in-depth discussion on some of the strategic decisions that the UK may choose to take over the coming months and years. So coming back to that term, trading on WTO terms that we've seen a lot of in the press. So what does that mean? Well, essentially the WTO is a trade agreement, a multilateral trade agreement, albeit one that encompasses a lot of countries and is sort of has a skeleton framework. But in the absence of a specific trade agreement with another territory, then we will trade on WTO terms. So we will trade under the GATS and GATS. So the GATT, General Agreement on Tariff and Trade Provisions, and the General Agreement on Trade and Services Provisions. And we will be bound by the specific schedules on tariffs and quotas that have been posted by the individual members of the WTO. So in the case of a no-deal Brexit, so that is where we do not have a trade agreement with the EU, my understanding is that the UK intends to post a temporary schedule of tariffs. And one of the key questions that's been posed throughout the negotiation process is, what do we mean by the most favoured nation rule that underpins the WTO mandate? And what that means is you essentially can't treat another member of the WTO more favourably than another in the absence of a specifically negotiated trade agreement. And one of the challenges in particular this has posed is looking at the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland and saying, well, if we have a different regime to allow trade to flow freely across the island of Ireland, does that mean actually we breach those most favoured nations rules, because actually we're offering preferential market access to Ireland and indeed then the EU without a trade agreement in place? WTO terms are also important because we need to assess what are the non-tariff barriers that might apply to trade with third parties. So that can include licensing, for border licensing requirements for goods crossing international borders. That can include specific regulations. So it's all of those parts of trading which aren't actually around the money, the duty. So what is the cost? What is the tax that's levied on those goods as they cross the border? And then obviously what we have now in place for the UK is a number of countries with which the UK has negotiated a continuity of the existing EU agreements. So, for example, that includes Switzerland and South Korea. So I'm going to pass back to Savannah, who's just going to give us a brief overview of the structure of the WTO.
Thank you, Ursula. So one of the key facets of the WTO is that it is run by its members, and this is something that can differentiate it from other international organisations. At the top of the structure, we have the Ministerial Conference, which is the highest level and meets every 2 years. Then the day-to-day work in between the ministerial conferences is handled by 3 bodies: the General Council, which is made up of delegates from all member countries and its various sub-councils and committees listed on the screen; the Secretariat, located in Geneva, which is headed up by the Director General, who is appointed by various members. Due to decisions being taken by members themselves, the Secretariat does not have a decision-making role itself. We also have the Dispute Settlement Body, which consists of panels and the Appellate Body. Then at the third level, you have the councils for each broad area of trade. For example, the Council for Trade in Goods, Council for Trade in Services, and the Council for Trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. 6 other bodies do report to the General Council, and they are deemed to be committees due to their scope of coverage being smaller. However, these do still consist of WTO members. Finally, each of the high-level councils has subsidiary bodies, which all consist of member countries. These deal with specialist subjects such as market access, agriculture, safeguard, and rules of origin, amongst others. And as you can see on the screen in more detail, there is a high-level structure chart from the WTO's website. So in terms of the mandate of the WTO, it has various key functions which we have listed on the screen. So primarily administering WTO trade agreements. The current set of WTO agreements is largely the outcome of the 1986 to 1994 Uruguay round negotiations, which included a major revision of the GATT. These agreements allow the members to operate a non-discriminatory trading system and also set out various rights and obligations for the members. It also provides a forum for trade negotiations. Additionally, it provides a dispute settlement procedure mechanism. The relevant procedure is the dispute settlement understanding. This allows governments to bring disputes to the WTO's attention if they believe that their rights under the WTO agreements are being infringed. Initially, the procedure encourages members to resolve disputes through consultations with each other. However, if this does prove to be unsuccessful, then disputes can be brought on a WTO level. The dispute settlement procedure contains various stages, including obtaining a ruling by a panel of experts, as well as the opportunity to appeal the ruling on legal grounds through the appellate body. So in terms of trade monitoring, all members must undergo periodic scrutiny, and the WTO undertakes regular monitoring of global trade measures. Following the 2008 financial crisis in particular, this monitoring role has become a regular function of the WTO. The WTO provides technical assistance and training for developing economies. All WTO agreements contain specific provisions to assist members with developing economies, for example, by giving longer timeframes to implement commitments and also additional support to build the infrastructure needed for these countries to participate in the WTO. The WTO's Committee on Trade and Development also looks in particular at developing economies' special needs. Furthermore, the WTO cooperates with other international organisations such as the World Health Organization and the International Monetary Fund.
And I think that last point you make, Savannah, on the cooperation with other international organisations is going to be really key, because we're already seeing at the moment a raft of regulations and new licensing provisions around both the looking at how we globally move some of the equipment and medicines needed to help countries treat and look for a vaccine for the COVID-19. So it's, you know, it's been a very good example of where trade is helping individual countries respond to a health crisis.
So continuing to look at the mandate of the WTO, we have listed out the various key WTO agreements. At the top of the agreement list, you have the umbrella agreement, which deals with the functioning of the WTO, which is known as the WTO agreement. As we mentioned previously, the current set of agreements are largely the outcome of the Uruguay negotiations, which did include a major revision of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, otherwise known as the GATT. This is the principal agreement dealing with goods, and historically tended to focus on goods, but more recent multilateral negotiations have focused on non-tariff barriers to trade, as Ursula mentioned earlier. Domestic regulatory policies have often been argued as creating impediments to cross-border trade, which is why in the Uruguay round this led to the focus expanding onto removing impediments to trade, so for example from food safety standards and other technical standards, harmonising regulations in relation to cross-border services, and as we can see on the screen, the principal agreement for services is the General Agreement on Trade and Services, the GATS, in which each of the members have a schedule of commitments in relation to services in particular. It also looked at harmonising intellectual property standards, and as you can see, we have the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement, otherwise known as TRIPS. It also looked at minimising discrimination in the treatment of foreign direct investment, and also minimising discrimination in government procurement, which has led to the agreement on government procurement in particular. We'll be covering a session on the GATT and GATS and also the TRIPS agreement in this webinar series. So we'll look at those in more detail then. So in terms of decision making within the WTO, taking a decision by consensus is how the WTO differentiates from other international organisations such as the IMF. The WTO is run by member governments, therefore the power of decision making is not delegated to a board of directors or to an individual. The original Article 25 of the GATT provided for joint action by majority vote. However, this in time has led to the development of a practice requiring consensus for all decision making. In particular, the WTO agreement only binds those members who have signed and ratified it, and the same goes for any amendments which are made to that agreement. So any proposals to amend a WTO agreement must be tabled for a minimum of 90 days. There are also specific provisions which can only be amended by unanimous agreement of all members, and these are set out in Article 10.2 of the agreement. All other provisions can be amended by a 2/3 majority of the Ministerial Conference. However, such amendment is only binding on the members who have voted in favour, but this is subject to an exception in Article 10.5, whereby the Ministerial Conference can decide by a 3/4 majority that an amendment is of such a nature that any member which has not accepted it within a period specified by the Ministerial Conference is free to withdraw from the WTO, or it may remain a member with the consent of the Ministerial Conference.
Thank you, Savannah. What we will do is we will include a module that looks at some of the future challenges for the WTO, and hopefully as we've gone through the session and we've given you some initial information on the institution, the structure and the framework of agreements, that you will have thought about some of the challenges, particularly in light of current geopolitical developments and how whether the WTO can keep up to speed with changing international trade landscape. If you do have any questions arising from this session or any of the other modules that we record, please do feel free to contact one of the team. Our contact details are here. Thanks very much for joining us, and we look forward to getting in contact with you soon. Bye-bye.